There are 3 rules every Terran laborer learns before stepping foot onto the gilded spire of the Valerion Empire. First, never look a Valerion in the secondary eyes. Second, never speak unless the bioresonant crystals in the walls hum a harmonic G-flat. Third, and most importantly, never, under any circumstances, touch the imperial regalia. To the Valerion, their clothing isn't just fabric. It is a sentient weave of ancestral history, a physical manifestation of their soul's rank. Elias Thorne, a grade 4 maintenance tech with grease under his fingernails and a persistent habit of humming old Terran folk songs, was currently failing all 3 rules. The gilded spire was an architectural impossibility, a needle of white dwarf matter and programmable glass that pierced the violet clouds of Valeria Prime. Elias had been sent there not for diplomacy, but because the atmospheric processors in the East Wing were rattling, and humans were the only species cheap enough and crazy enough to crawl into the hyper-pressurized vents to fix them. He was exiting a service conduit, wiping a smudge of coolant from his forehead, when the Grand Procession began. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and crushed lilies. The High Court emerged, a sea of shimmering 7-foot-tall beings with skin like polished obsidian, and 4 eyes that glowed with a cold, predatory intelligence. At their center walked Empress Xylara the Eternal. She was a vision of terrifying, frozen perfection. Her gown was made of living light, and trailing behind her was the Mantle of Sovereignty, a 12-foot cape of void silk that allegedly contained the recorded heartbeats of every empress for 10,000 years. It was also, as Elias noticed with a mechanic's twitching eye, snagged. As the empress glided toward the dais, a jagged piece of decorative floor plating, loosened by the very vibrations Elias had been sent to fix, caught the edge of the sacred void silk. The Empress didn't feel it yet, but Elias saw the tension. In 3 more steps, the ancient, priceless fabric would tear, or worse, the Empress of 1,000 systems would be yanked backward off her feet in front of the entire High Council, an embarrassment that, in Valerian culture, was often settled with ritual execution. "Hey, stop!" Elias barked. The hum of the crystals died instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like a vacuum. 300 Valerian nobles froze, their secondary eyes snapping toward the small, dusty human in the jumpsuit. Empress Xylara paused, her head turning with the slow, lethal grace of a stalking cat. Her gaze fell on Elias. It was like being stared at by a supernova. Elias didn't think about the treaties. He didn't think about the fact that his presence in the hallway was a borderline capital offense. He just saw a problem that needed fixing. He lunged forward, dropping to his knees behind her. "What is this creature doing?" a high priest hissed, his voice like grinding stones. "Remove its hands. Purge the air it breathes." Elias ignored them. He reached out and grasped the Mantle of Sovereignty. A collective gasp, a sound of genuine physical pain, erupted from the crowd. To them, it was as if he had reached out and grabbed the Empress's own heart. The fabric felt cold, vibrating with a strange low-frequency power. With the practiced dexterity of a man who had spent a decade unjamming delicate gears, Elias unhooked the silk from the jagged metal. He didn't just let it go. He smoothed the fabric, brushing away a speck of dust with his thumb, and then gave the heavy hem a gentle, respectful pat to ensure it sat flush against the marble. "There you go, Your Majesty," Elias muttered, still on one knee, looking up at her with a lopsided, weary smile. "Good as new. You might want to have the floor crew look at those plates, though. They're a real trip hazard." Xylara looked down at the human, then she looked at her cape, then she looked back at Elias. For the first time in recorded Valerian history, an empress's skin, normally a deep, regal obsidian, began to shimmer with a distinct roiling shade of sunset violet. She was blushing. "You touched the mantle," she whispered, her voice echoing through the silent hall. "I fixed it," Elias corrected simply. The royal guard recovered from their shock. 6 crystalline halberds leveled at Elias's throat, the tips glowing with disintegration energy. "Human," the high priest screamed, "you have defiled the Eternal. You shall be unmade. Xylara didn't look at the priest. She didn't look at the guards. Her 4 eyes were locked onto Elias's brown ones, searching for fear and finding only a strange, stubborn kindness. Wait, the Empress commanded. The violet hue on her cheeks deepened. Take him to the high observation cell. I will deal with this transgression personally. As Elias was dragged away by his collar, his boots scuffing the pristine floor, he caught one last glimpse of Xylara. She was touching the spot on her cape where his hand had been, her expression unreadable, her face still glowing that impossible, radiant purple. The high observation cell was less of a prison and more of a gilded birdcage. Suspended over a 1,000-foot drop into the glowing mists of the capital city, the room was made of transparent diamond poli. There were no bars, only a shimmering field of kinetic energy that hummed with a lethally high frequency. Elias Thorne sat on the floor, leaning against the cold glass. He wasn't meditating or praying. He was using a small, illicit multi-tool to clean the grime out from under his fingernails. You are remarkably calm for a man whose atoms are scheduled for dispersal, a voice boomed. Elias didn't jump. He looked up to see the High Inquisitor, a Valerion noble whose skin was so dark it seemed to swallow the room's light. Behind him stood a phalanx of guards, their spears crackling. I've worked on fusion reactors with failing magnetic seals, Elias said, snapping his tool shut. Once you've stared into the heart of a miniature sun, a bunch of tall folks in shiny robes don't feel quite as scary. The High Inquisitor stepped into the cell, the energy field parting for him like water. You touched the soul weave. You laid calloused, primate hands upon the Empress's physical divinity. Explain this blasphemy. Was it an assassination attempt? A biological strike? Speak, or we will extract the truth from your synapses. Elias stood up, dusting off his jumpsuit. He looked the Inquisitor dead in his secondary eyes. Rule number 1, be damned. It was a snag, Elias said plainly. A snag? Yeah, a snag. Your floor plating is uneven. If she'd taken another step, she would have tripped. That cape, the mantle, whatever you call it, would have ripped right down the middle. I didn't see an empress or a physical divinity. I saw a lady about to take a very expensive faceplant in front of her entire kingdom. So, I fixed it. The Inquisitor recoiled as if Elias had slapped him. You claim to have saved her from a minor physical stumble by committing a metaphysical atrocity? You treated the Eternal Sovereign like a common pedestrian. I treated her like a person, Elias corrected. He took a step forward, ignoring the guards who leveled their weapons. Look, I get it. You guys have all these rules. You've got protocols for breathing and ceremonies for sneezing. But back on Earth, if someone's about to trip, you catch them. It's not an atrocity. It's called being a decent neighbor. We are not neighbors, the Inquisitor hissed. We are the Valerion. We are the architects of the star streams. You are a scavenger, a repair drone with a heartbeat. Maybe, Elias shrugged. But your repair drone is the only one in this room who actually gave a damn about the woman inside the dress instead of just the dress itself. You all stood there watching her walk toward a fall. I was the only one who moved. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 10,000 years of tradition being poked by a stick. The Inquisitor opened his mouth to deliver a death sentence, but the chamber doors hissed open. The guards dropped to their knees so fast their armor clattered against the diamond floor. The Inquisitor followed suit, pressing his forehead to the ground. Empress Xylara stepped into the cell. She was no longer wearing the heavy ceremonial crown, and her mantle was draped loosely over one shoulder. The violet tint had faded from her skin, replaced by a pale, translucent shimmer that indicated deep thought. Leave us, she commanded. Your radiance, the Inquisitor sputtered. This creature is a chaotic element. He lacks the fundamental resonance to understand. I said. Xylara's voice dropped an octave, vibrating the very glass of the cell. Leave. Us. The room cleared in seconds. Elias was left alone with the most powerful being in the sector. She didn't approach him. She stayed by the door, watching him with all 4 eyes. You told the Inquisitor you saw a lady about to trip, she said, her voice soft, devoid of the regal reverb. I did, Elias said, his bravado softening into genuine sincerity. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, Your Majesty. Truly. I know I broke about 100 laws. But where I come from, you don't let someone hurt themselves just because they're wearing a fancy title." Xylara took a slow step forward. "No one has touched me without a ritual cleansing and a 3-day prayer cycle in 400 years. When you took the silk, I felt the warmth of your hand through the weave. It was irrational. It was tactile. It was human," Elias offered. "It was terrifying," she whispered, and for a fleeting second, the Empress of 1,000 systems looked remarkably small. "And I wish to know why you aren't trembling." The high observation cell was silent, save for the low thrum of the city fortress's gravity stabilizers. Empress Xylara stood only a few feet from Elias, her presence radiating a cold, crystalline power that usually made subordinates collapse in religious ecstasy or terror. Elias, however, just leaned against the transparent wall and hooked his thumbs into his belt loops. "You want to know why I'm not trembling?" Elias asked, his voice echoing softly. "Truth is, Your Majesty, I've spent my life working with machines. A machine doesn't care if you're a king or a beggar. If you don't treat it right, it breaks. If you respect the way it's built, it works. I guess I see people the same way." Xylara paced the small circle of the cell, her movements fluid and rhythmic. "We are not built human. We are cultivated. Our lives are a series of calculated resonances. My every word is scripted by the ancestral echoes. My every movement is choreographed to maintain the psychic stability of the Empire." She stopped and looked at him, her 4 eyes shimmering with a sudden sharp intensity. "When you touched the mantle, you didn't just snag a fabric. You introduced noise into a perfect symphony. For 3 seconds, the entire Valerian collective felt a shudder, a deviation." "Sounds exhausting," Elias said bluntly. Xylara blinked. "Exhausting?" "Living like a statue," Elias explained. "Never being able to just be. On Earth we have this saying, 'Heavy is the head that wears the crown,' but you've turned the crown into a cage. You're the most powerful being in the sector, and you can't even stumble without it being a galactic crisis." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dented metal sphere, a kinetic fidget toy he'd welded together from scrap. He tossed it lightly into the air and caught it. The simple, tactile click-clack of the metal seemed loud in the sterile room. "What is that?" Xylara asked, her gaze following the sphere. "Just a toy. Keeps the hands busy when the mind is racing." He held it out to her. "Want to try?" The Empress recoiled as if he'd offered her a live grenade. "I cannot touch a common object. It has not been harmonized." "It's just steel and ball bearings, Xylara. It won't bite." She flinched at the use of her name without the titles. The violet shimmer returned to her neck, creeping up toward her cheekbones. Slowly, with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, she reached out. Her long, slender fingers, tipped with obsidian nails, closed around the warm metal. She felt the residual heat from his pocket. She felt the messy texture of the weld marks. For a moment, the cold logic of the Valerian symphony was drowned out by the simple, physical reality of the object. "It is chaotic," she whispered, her thumb tentatively moving the spheres. "It has no resonance." "It's not supposed to," Elias said, stepping a bit closer. "It's just something to hold on to when the world feels too big. You're always looking at the great plan or the ancestral echoes. When was the last time you just looked at what was right in front of you? When was the last time someone just talked to you, not the Empress?" Xylara looked up from the toy, her 4 eyes softening. The mask of the eternal sovereign, that rigid, frozen expression of divine indifference, slipped. Her lips parted, and for the first time, Elias saw a flicker of genuine, raw loneliness in her gaze. "Never," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Since my ascension, I have been a symbol, a vessel. I am seen by billions, yet I am invisible." "Well," Elias said, giving her a wink that would have seen him executed by any other Valerian. "I see you. You're a bit stiff and your taste in flooring is terrible, but you're definitely there." Xylara let out a sound, A short, melodic huff that wasn't quite a laugh, but was the closest thing her species had to one. The violet blush on her face deepened to a rich, royal plum. Before she could respond, the walls of the cell suddenly pulsed with a violent crimson light. A klaxon wailed. Not a harmonic hum, but a jagged, discordant shriek that tore through the air. "Breach!" a voice screamed over the comms. "The Vex have bypassed the orbital shield. Assassination squads are on the gilded spire." The floor shuddered as a massive explosion rocked the station. Xylara stumbled, the kinetic toy falling from her hand. This time there was no one to catch her cape, but Elias was already moving. The gilded spire, a monument to 10,000 years of stability, groaned like a dying beast. The Vex, insectoid scavengers from the void who traveled in swarms of living metal, had done the impossible. They hadn't just attacked, they had phased through the perfect Valerion shields using a discordant frequency that turned the Empire's own harmonic technology against itself. The resonance... "It's shattered," Xylara whispered, clutching her chest. For a Valerian, the sudden loss of the station's background hum was like a human suddenly losing their inner ear. She swayed, her four eyes clouding with sensory overload. "Don't think about the noise, focus on my voice," Elias shouted over the roar of another explosion. He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed the Empress by her shoulders, steadying her. To the Valerian guards outside the transparent doors, it was the ultimate sacrilege. But they were currently too busy being vaporized by Vex splinter rifles to protest. The cell's energy field flickered and died as the power grid buckled. The door slid open with a jagged grind. "We need to move, Xylara. Now!" "The Royal Guard, they will protect," she started. But a Vex infiltrator, a six-limbed nightmare of serrated chrome, skittered around the corner. Its ocular sensors locked onto the Empress's glowing regal signature. It raised a biological railgun, the barrel glowing with toxic green light. Elias didn't have a pulse pistol. He didn't have a crystalline blade. He had a heavy-duty adjustable wrench and a lifetime of pent-up Terran stubbornness. "Get down!" Elias lunged. He didn't aim for the armored thorax. He swung the heavy steel tool at the creature's delicate leg joints, the pinch points he knew from repairing hydraulic loaders. With a sickening crunch, the Vex's forward limb snapped. The creature shrieked, its shot going wide and melting a hole in the diamond pulley wall. Elias didn't stop. He scrambled onto the creature's back, jamming the handle of the wrench into its sensory cluster and twisting with everything he had. The Vex thrashed, its metallic shriek echoing through the hall before collapsing into a heap of twitching scrap. Elias stood up, breathing hard, his knuckles bleeding. He looked at Xylara, who was staring at him with a mix of horror and profound fascination. You fought it with a piece of unrefined iron," she breathed. "Without armor. Without a psychic link. Why?" "Because I'm a human and that thing was annoying me," Elias grunted, wiping a smear of black Vex fluid from his cheek. "And because you're too important to end up as bug food. Come on, we need to get to the auxiliary maintenance tunnels. Your fancy elevators are death traps right now." He grabbed her hand, not the fabric of her sleeve, but her actual hand. Her skin was cool, like fine porcelain, but he felt her pulse racing against his palm. For the first time in her life, the Empress of the Valerian was being led, not by a protocol or a priest, but by a grease-stained mechanic with a death grip. They ran through the crumbling corridors. The spire was a labyrinth of beauty, but Elias knew the guts of the place. He kicked open a service hatch, a tiny dark crawl space lined with vibrating conduits. In there, it's shielded against thermal scans, Elias commanded. "I cannot crawl," Xylara protested, looking at her magnificent tattered gown. "It is beneath the dignity of—" "Xylara, look at me," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent growl. "Right now you aren't an empress. You're a person who wants to live. And I'm the guy who's going to make sure that happens. Now move your royal backside into that vent before the next swarm gets here." She looked at him, her four eyes wide. The violet blush flared again, brighter than ever, illuminating the dark hallway. With a sharp, defiant intake of breath, she hiked up the priceless silks of her gown and scrambled into the grease-stained tunnel. As Elias pulled the hatch shut behind them, he heard the skittering of 100 Vex claws on the marble floors outside. In the cramped, dark heat of the maintenance shaft, their shoulders pressed together. He could feel the warmth of her body, the frantic rhythm of her heart. "You are a very strange creature, Elias Thorne," she whispered in the dark. "I've been told," he replied, his hand still holding hers. "Now stay quiet. We've got a long crawl ahead of us." The maintenance shaft was a claustrophobic ribcage of hissing steam pipes and throbbing power cables. It was never designed for an empress. The jagged edges of the galvanized steel tore at Xylara's void silk gown, shredding the living light until it was nothing more than dull gray rags. "My ancestors, they would weep," Xylara whispered, her voice trembling as she crawled through a pool of lukewarm coolant. "The resonance of this garment is extinguished. I am disconnected." Elias, leading the way with a small penlight clenched in his teeth, paused and looked back. The glow from the conduits cast harsh orange shadows across her face. Her obsidian skin was streaked with grease, and one of her decorative head crests was chipped. She looked less like a goddess and more like a survivor. "The silk didn't make you the Empress, Xylara," Elias said, his voice muffled by the light in his mouth. He spat the penlight into his hand. "And the noise out there, that perfect symphony you're so worried about? It's just a recording. Real life is down here. It's messy, it's hot, and it smells like ozone and old oil. But you're still breathing, aren't you?" "I feel diminished," she confessed, her secondary eyes blinking rapidly, a sign of deep Valerian distress. "Without the harmony, I am just a physical shell." "Bull," Elias snapped. He reached out and grabbed her hand again, squeezing it firmly. "You're the one who told the Inquisitor to shut up. You're the one who decided to trust a human mechanic instead of waiting for a guard that wasn't coming. That wasn't protocol, Xylara. That was you." A massive shudder rocked the spire. Above them, the screech of Vex saws cutting through the primary bulkhead sounded like giant fingernails on a chalkboard. "They've reached the inner sanctum," Xylara gasped. "If they interface with the core, they won't just kill me. They'll broadcast a discordant signal that will shatter the minds of every Valerion on the planet. They'll turn our own biology into a weapon." Elias looked at a schematic etched into a maintenance panel nearby. His eyes tracked the coolant lines. "The core is cooled by liquid helium-3, right? If we vent the primary regulators, we can flash freeze the entire sanctum. It'll kick the Vex out of the system, but it'll also lock down the palace for a week." "The Council would never allow it," Xylara said. "To freeze the core is to silence the song of the ancestors. It is the ultimate taboo." Elias turned to her, his face inches from hers in the cramped space. "Protocol or people, Xylara? Your ancestors are already dead. Your people are out there right now, about to have their brains fried. Are you going to be the Empress who watched her world burn because she was afraid to break a rule?" Xylara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the grit in his teeth, the blood on his knuckles, and the absolute, unwavering certainty in his eyes. For a species that lived by calculated probabilities, the raw, irrational courage of a human was like a physical blow. "How do we do it?" she asked, her voice hardening. "There's a manual override valve 3 levels down. It's in a high radiation zone," Elias said, already moving. "The Vex won't go near it, their tech fries in high rad. But a human can handle it for a few minutes. I'll go. You stay here." "No," Xylara said, grabbing his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I will not be saved while you perish in the dark. I am the Empress. If we are to silence the song, I will be the one to turn the key." They reached the radiation vestibule 10 minutes later. The air shimmered with invisible heat. Elias could feel the leaden weight of the exposure starting to settle in his bones, but he pushed forward. The valve was a massive, ancient wheel of lead-shielded iron. It was seized shut by centuries of disuse. Elias threw his weight against it. It didn't budge. He groaned, his muscles straining until they screamed. "Help me," he roared. Xylara stepped beside him. She didn't use a royal gesture. She put her shoulder against the iron, her silk-clad arms bracing against the grimy metal. Together, the human mechanic and the Valerian sovereign pushed. With a scream of protesting metal, the valve turned. A deep, bass hum rumbled through the floor as the liquid helium surged. Above them, the frantic chittering of the Vex turned into shrieks of agony as the temperature in the sanctum plummeted to near absolute zero. Elias collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Xylara sank down beside him, her regal poise utterly gone. She looked at her hands, blackened with soot and bruised from the effort. "We did it," Elias wheezed, a weak grin spreading across his face. "We broke the spire." Xylara looked at the valve, then at the human who had forced her to save herself. She began to laugh, a clear, melodic sound that had nothing to do with the ancestral echoes and everything to do with the sheer, ridiculous joy of being alive. "You are a terrible influence, Elias Thorne," she said, her face glowing a brilliant, unashamed violet. The freeze had worked. The Vex were neutralized, their metallic carapaces shattered by the thermal shock, but the gilded spire was no longer a place of quiet, crystalline perfection. It was a ruin of ice, soot, and the lingering smell of human sweat. When the High Council finally breached the maintenance level with a battalion of pristine royal guards, they didn't find a dignified sovereign awaiting rescue. They found Empress Xylara sitting on a rusted floor grating, her gown in tatters, sharing a lukewarm nutrient pouch with a human mechanic. "Your radiance," the High Priest shrieked, his primary eyes bulging. "Step away from that bipedal infection. The core is silent. The song is broken. What have you done?" The council members huddled together, their obsidian skin turning a pale, sickly gray as they took in the scene. To them, the sight of Xylara with grease on her cheek was more catastrophic than the invasion itself. Elias started to stand up, his joints popping, but Xylara placed a firm hand on his shoulder. She stood first, moving with a new kind of grace, not the choreographed dance of the court, but the steady, grounded weight of a survivor. "The Vex are purged," Xylara said, her voice echoing through the chamber without the aid of the harmonic amplifiers. It was raw, clear, and commanding. "And this bipedal infection is the reason you are still alive to complain about the silence." "He has defiled the imperial person," an advisor cried out. "He has touched the mantle. He has led you into the filth of the substructures. This is a scandal that will dissolve the empire." The High Priest stepped forward, his crystalline staff glowing with a threatening light. "The human must be purged to restore the balance. We must sacrifice the outlier to reclaim the symphony." Elias felt the familiar weight of the wrench in his belt, but he didn't reach for it. He stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Xylara. He looked at the council, these ancient, powerful beings who were so terrified of a little noise. "You guys really don't get it, do you?" Elias said, his voice flat and unimpressed. "The balance you're talking about was a death trap. You were so busy listening to a 10,000-year-old song that you didn't hear the bugs cutting through your front door. You call this a scandal? I call it a wake-up call." "Silence, scavenger," the priest roared. "You speak of things beyond your comprehension." "I comprehend plenty," Elias countered, taking a step toward the priest. "I comprehend that while you were hiding in your bunkers praying to your echoes, Xylara was turning a lead valve in a radiation zone. I comprehend that she's got more resonance in her pinky finger than this entire room full of cowards. You want to purge the man who saved your empress? Go ahead, but you'll be proving that the Valerian Empire is already dead. It's just too stubborn to lie down." The council fell into a stunned, offended silence. No one had ever spoken to them with such plain-speaking brutality. Xylara stepped in front of Elias, her 4 eyes glowing with a fierce, protective light. "The human is right," she declared. "The symphony was beautiful, but it was deafening us to the truth. We are not just resonances in a machine. We are living beings. From this day forward, the protocol of separation is abolished. The humans will not be relegated to the vents. They will be invited to the table." "You cannot mean this," the High Priest whispered. "The scandal. The other noble houses." "Let them talk," Xylara said. a small, daring smile playing on her lips as she glanced back at Elias. I find I rather enjoy the noise. She reached out, not in a ritual gesture but in a very human one, and took Elias's hand in front of the entire court. The collective gasp of the council was loud enough to vibrate the remaining glass in the room. Elias squeezed her hand. "You're doing it again," he whispered. "Doing what?" she asked. "Blushing," he replied with a grin. "And for the record, it's a much better look on you than the obsidian." 6 months had passed since the silence of the spire, as the historians were already calling it. The gilded spire had been rebuilt, but the architecture was different now. The crystalline walls no longer hummed with a rigid, oppressive G-flat. Instead, they resonated with a complex, ever-changing melody, a fusion of Valerian harmonics and the rhythmic, percussive pulse of Terran jazz. Elias Thorne wasn't crawling through vents anymore. He was wearing a suit, not the stiff, suffocating robes of the Valerian court, but a sharp, charcoal-gray Terran diplomat's jacket, though he still kept his multi-tool clipped to his belt. He stood on the imperial balcony looking out over the city. Below, human transport ships mingled with Valerian light skiffs. It was a messy, loud, and vibrant sight. "The council still has a collective migraine every time you walk into the room," a melodic voice said behind him. Elias turned to see Xylara. She was wearing a new gown, one made of Terran silk and Valerian light thread. It didn't carry the weight of 10,000 years of ancestors. It was a new weave, light and flexible. "I try my best," Elias said, leaning back against the railing. "I think the High Priest actually fainted when I brought a plate of Earth-style BBQ to the summit last week." Xylara laughed, a sound that was now a frequent feature of the palace halls. She stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. He claimed the olfactory aggression was a violation of the third harmonic. Then he secretly asked for the recipe. She looked out at the horizon, her 4 eyes tracking the setting suns. The violet tint on her skin was no longer a sign of shock. It was a permanent, healthy glow, the color of a species that had finally learned to breathe. "The Empire is changing, Elias," she said softly. "The person-first initiative is causing ripples. For the first time, my people are asking what they want to do, rather than what they are destined to do. It's chaotic. It's terrifying." "That's just called freedom, Xylara," Elias said, turning to face her. "It's a bit of a bumpy ride, but the view is better." Xylara reached out and adjusted his collar. Her touch was no longer hesitant or ritualistic, it was familiar. "I suppose you're right, though I did have to explain to the High Council why you were found yesterday teaching the Royal Guard how to play poker." "They needed to learn about bluffing," Elias defended with a shrug. "Your people are too honest for their own good. It's a tactical weakness." Xylara stepped closer, her gaze lingering on his. "And what of us, Elias? The human who broke the Empress and the Empress who chose to stay broken." "I didn't break you, Xylara," Elias said, his voice dropping to a warm, sincere tone. "I just fixed the snag. The rest was all you." He reached out and, with a daring grin, playfully flicked the edge of her new, shorter cape. "By the way, your cape is straight today, I checked." Xylara's face erupted into a brilliant, deep plum. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, a gesture of profound intimacy in both their cultures. "Why is the Empress blushing?" she whispered, echoing the question that had become a popular joke among the palace staff. "Because," Elias replied, his eyes sparkling with wit, "she knows I'm about to tell her that her crown is crooked." Xylara laughed, a bright, defiant sound that echoed out over the new, noisy, and wonderfully imperfect capital of the Valerian. The universe was still a dangerous place, and the Vex were still out there in the dark. But for the first time in an eternity, the Empress wasn't facing it alone. She had a mechanic by her side, a wrench in his belt, and a stubborn human heart that refused to follow the rules. If you enjoyed this story of human resilience and interspecies connection, please like, share, and subscribe to the HFY Soundscape channel for more tales from the stars.